The New Testament Apocrypha are a number of writings by early Christians that give accounts of Jesus and his teachings, the nature of God, or the teachings of his apostles and of their lives. Some of these writings have been cited as scripture by early Christians, but since the 5th century a widespread consensus has emerged limiting the New Testament to the 27 books of the modern canon. Thus, Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox and Protestant churches generally do not view these New Testament Apocrypha as part of the Bible. Definition: the word apocrypha means things put away, or things hidden, and comes from the Greek through the Latin. The general term is usually applied to the books that were considered by the Church as useful, but not divinely inspired. As such, to refer to Gnostic writings as apocryphal is misleading since they would not be classified in the same category by Orthodox believers. Often used by the Greek Fathers was the term anti-legomena, or spoken against, although some canonical books were also spoken against, such as the Apocalypse of John in the East. Often used by scholars is the term pseudepigrapha, or falsely inscribed, or falsely attributed, in the sense that the writings were written by an anonymous author who appended the name of an apostle to his work, such as in the Gospel of Peter or the Ethiopic Apocalypse of Enoch. Almost all books, in both Old and New Testaments, called Apocrypha, in the Protestant tradition are pseudepigrapha. In the Catholic and Orthodox traditions, what are called the Apocrypha by Protestants include the Deuterocanonical books. In the Catholic tradition, the term Apocrypha is synonymous with what Protestants would call the pseudepigrapha, the latter term of which is almost exclusively used by scholars. History. Development of the New Testament canon. Some works are categorized as New Testament Apocrypha is indicative of the wide range of responses that were engendered in the interpretation of the message of Jesus of Nazareth. During the first several centuries of the transmission of that message, considerable debate turned on safeguarding its authenticity. Three key methods of addressing this survive to the present day. Ordination, where groups authorize individuals as reliable teachers of the message. Creeds, where groups define the boundaries of interpretation of the message. And canons, which list the primary documents certain groups believe contain the message originally taught by Jesus. There was substantial debate about which books should be included in the canons. In general, those books that the majority regarded as the earliest books about Jesus were the ones included. Books that were not accepted into the canons are now termed apocryphal. Some of them were vigorously suppressed and survive only as fragments. The earliest lists of canonical works of the New Testament were not quite the same as modern lists. For example, the Book of Revelation was regarded as disputed by some Christians, while Shepherd of Hermas was considered genuine by others, and appears in the Codex Sinaiticus. The works that presented themselves as authentic, but that did not obtain general acceptance from within the churches are called New Testament Apocrypha. These are not accepted as canonical by most mainstream Christian denominations. Only the Ethiopian Orthodox Church recognizes the Shepherd of Hermas, 1 Clement, Acts of Paul, and several Old Testament books that most other denominations reject. But it should be noted that this church does not adhere to an explicit canon. The Syriac Peshitta, used by all the various Syrian churches, originally did not include 2 Peter, 2 John, 3 John, Jude and Revelation and Theodoret from the School of Antioch. Western Syrians have added the remaining 5 books to their New Testament canons in modern times. Today, the official lectionaries followed by the Malankara Syrian Orthodox Church and the East Syriac Chaldean Catholic Church, which is in communion with the Bishop of Rome, still only present lessons from the 22 books of the original Peshitta. The Armenian Apostolic Church at times has included the 3rd Epistle to the Corinthians, but does not always list it with the other 27 canonical New Testament books. This church did not accept revelation into its Bible until 1200 CE. The New Testament of the Coptic Bible, adopted by the Egyptian Church, includes the two epistles of Clement. Modern scholarship and translation English translations were made in the early 18th century by William Wake, and by Jeremiah Jones, and collected in 1820 by William Hone's Apocryphal New Testament. The series Ante-Nicene Fathers, Volume 8, contains translations by Alexander Walker. New translations by M.R. James appeared in 1924, and were revised by J.K. Elliott in 1991. The Apocryphal New Testament. The standard, scholarly edition of the New Testament Apocrypha in German is that of Schneemelcher, and in English its translation by Wilson. Tischendorf and other scholars began to study New Testament Apocrypha seriously in the 19th century and produce new translations. Books that are known objectively not to have existed in antiquity are usually not considered part of the New Testament Apocrypha. Among these are the Liber-Luster Nativitate, Sancti Mariae and the Latin Infancy Gospel. The latter two did not exist in antiquity, and they seem to be based on the earlier Infancy Gospels. Canonical Gospels. 4 Gospels came to be accepted as part of the New Testament canon: Gospel according to Matthew, Gospel according to Mark, Gospel according to Luke, Gospel according to John. Infancy Gospels. The rarity of information about the childhood of Jesus in the canonical Gospels led to a hunger of early Christians for more detail about the early life of Jesus. This was supplied by a number of 2nd century and later texts, known as Infancy Gospels, none of which were accepted into the biblical canon, but the very number of their surviving manuscripts attests to their continued popularity. Most of these were based on the earliest Infancy Gospels, namely the Infancy Gospel of James and Infancy Gospel of Thomas, and on their later combination into the Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew. The other significant early Infancy Gospels are the Syriac Infancy Gospel, the history of Joseph the Carpenter and the life of John the Baptist. Jewish Christian Gospels. The Jewish Christian Gospels were Gospels of a Jewish Christian character quoted by Clement of Alexandria, Oregon, Eusebius, Epiphanius, Jerome and probably Didymus the Blind. Most modern scholars have concluded that there was one Gospel in Aramaic, Hebrew and at least 2 in Greek, although a minority argue that there were only 2, Aramaic, Hebrew and Greek. None of these Gospels survives today, but attempts have been made to reconstruct them from references in the Church Fathers. The reconstructed texts of the Gospels are usually categorized under New Testament Apocrypha. The standard edition of Schneemelcher describes the texts of 3 Jewish Christian Gospels as follows. 1. The Gospel of the Ebionites. 7 quotations by Epiphanius. 2. The Gospel of the Hebrews. 1 quotation ascribed to Cyril of Jerusalem, plus GH 2 to 7 quotations by Clement, Oregon, and Jerome. 3. The Gospel of the Nazarenes, GN 1 to GN 23 are mainly from Jerome, GN 24 to GN 36 are from medieval sources. Some scholars consider that the 2 last named are in fact the same source. Non-canonical Gospels. Other documents entitled Gospels came into existence in the 2nd and 3rd Christian centuries. Sometimes, those attributed to the text state elsewhere that their text is the earlier version, or that their text excises all the additions and distortions made by their opponents to the more recognized version of the text. The Church Fathers insisted that these people were the ones making distortions, but some modern scholars do not. It remains to be seen whether any are earlier and more accurate versions of the canonical texts. Details of their contents only survive in the attacks on them by their opponents, and so for the most part it is uncertain as to how extensively different they are, and whether any constitute entirely different works. These texts include Gospel of Marcion, Gospel of Mani, Gospel of Apelles, Gospel of Badasanes, Gospel of Basilides, sayings. Gospels. One or two texts take the form of brief logia, sayings and parables of Jesus, which are not embedded in a connected narrative. Gospel of Thomas. Some scholars regard the Gospel of Thomas as part of the tradition from which the canonical Gospels eventually emerged. In any case, both of these documents are important as showing us what the theoretical Q document might have looked like. Passion Gospels. A number of Gospels are concerned specifically with the Passion of Jesus. Gospel of Peter, Gospel of Nicodemus, Pseudo-Cyril of Jerusalem, on the life and the Passion of Christ. Gospel of Bartholomew, Questions of Bartholomew, Resurrection of Jesus Christ. Although three texts take Bartholomew's name, it may be that one of the Questions of Bartholomew or the Resurrection of Jesus Christ is in fact the unknown Gospel of Bartholomew. Harmonized Gospels. A number of texts aim to provide a single harmonization of the canonical Gospels that eliminates discordances among them by presenting a unified text derived from them to some degree. The most widely read of these was the Diates Aaron, Gnostic texts. In the modern era, many Gnostic texts have been uncovered, especially from the Nag Hammadi library. Some texts take the form of an expounding of the esoteric cosmology and ethics held by the Gnostics. Often this was in the form of dialogue in which Jesus expounds esoteric knowledge while his disciples raise questions concerning it. There is also a text known as the Epistula Apostolorum, which is a polemic against Gnostic esoterica, but written in a similar style as the Gnostic texts. Dialogues with Jesus. Apocryphon of James, Book of Thomas the Contender, Dialogue of the Savior, Gospel of Judas, Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Philip, Greek Gospel of the Egyptians, the Sophia of Jesus Christ, General texts concerning Jesus. Coptic Apocalypse of Paul, Gospel of Truth, Gnostic Apocalypse of Peter, Pistis Sophia, Second Treatise of the Great Seth. Sethian texts concerning Jesus. The Sethians were a Gnostic group who originally worshipped the biblical Seth as a messianic figure, later treating Jesus as a reincarnation of Seth. They produced numerous texts expounding their esoteric cosmology, usually in the form of visions. Apocryphon of John, Coptic Gospel of the Egyptians, Trimorphic Protenoia, Ritual diagrams. Some of the Gnostic texts appear to consist of diagrams and instructions for use in religious rituals. Ophite diagrams, Books of Jude, Acts. Several texts concern themselves with the subsequent lives of the apostles, usually with highly supernatural events. Almost half of these are said to have been written by Lucius Charinus, a companion of John the Apostle. The Acts of Thomas and the Acts of Peter and the 12 are often considered Gnostic texts. While most of the texts are believed to have been written in the 2nd century, at least two, the Acts of Barnabas and the Acts of Peter and Paul are believed to have been written as late as the 5th century. Acts of Andrew, Acts of Barnabas, Acts of John, Acts of the Martyrs, Acts of Paul and Thecla, Acts of Peter and Andrew, Acts of Peter and Paul, Acts of Peter and the 12, Acts of Philip, Acts of Pilate, Acts of Thomas, Acts of Timothy, Acts of Xanthippe, Polyxena, and Rebecca. Epistles. There are also non-canonical epistles between individuals or to Christians in general. Some of them were regarded very highly by the early Church. Epistle of Barnabas, Epistles of Clement, Epistle of the Corinthians to Paul, Epistle of Ignatius to the Smyrnians, Epistle of Ignatius to the Trallians, Epistle of Polycarp to the Philippians, Epistle to Dionysius, Epistle to the Laodiceans, Epistle to Seneca the Younger, Third Epistle to the Corinthians, accepted in the past by some in the Armenian Orthodox Church. Apocalypses. Several works frame themselves as visions, often discussing the future, afterlife, or both. Apocalypse of Paul, Apocalypse of Peter, Apocalypse of Pseudo-Methodius, Apocalypse of Thomas, Apocalypse of Stephen, First Apocalypse of James, Second Apocalypse of James, the Shepherd of Hermas, Fate of Mary, Several texts consist of descriptions of the events surrounding the varied fate of Mary, the homegoing of Mary, the falling asleep of the Mother of God, the descent of Mary, miscellany. These texts, due to their content or form, do not fit into the other categories: apostolic constitutions, Book of Nepos, canons of the Apostles, Cave of Treasures, Clementine literature, Didache, Liturgy of St. James, Penitence of Origen, Prayer of Paul, Sentences of Sextus, Physiologus, Book of the Bee, fragments. In addition to the known apocryphal works, there are also small fragments of texts, parts of unknown works. Some of the more significant fragments are the unknown Berlin Gospel, the Nazain fragment, the Fame fragment, the Secret Gospel of Mark, whose authenticity has been challenged, the Oxyrhynchus Gospels, the Egerton Gospel, lost works. Several texts are mentioned in many ancient sources and would probably be considered part of the Apocrypha, but no known text has survived. Gospel of Eve. It is possible that this is the Gospel of Perfection he alludes to in XXVI. 2. The quotation shows that this Gospel was the expression of complete pantheism. Gospel of the Four Heavenly Realms. Gospel of Matthias. Gospel of Perfection. Gospel of the 70. Gospel of Thaddeus. Gospel of the 12. Memoria Apostolorum. Close candidates for canonization. While many of the books listed here were considered heretical, others were not considered particularly heretical in content, but in fact were well accepted as significant spiritual works. While some of the following works appear in complete Bibles from the 4th century, such as 1 Clement and the Shepherd of Hermas, showing their general popularity, they were not included when the canon was formally decided at the end of that century. 1 and 2 Clement, Shepherd of Hermas, Didache, Epistle of Barnabas, Apocalypse of Peter, 3rd Epistle to the Corinthians. Evaluation. Among historians of early Christianity, the books are considered invaluable, especially those that almost made it into the final canon, such as Shepherd of Hermas. Bart Ehrman, for example, said, "The victors in the struggles to establish Christian orthodoxy not only won their theological battles, they also rewrote the history of the conflict." Later readers then naturally assumed that the victorious views had been embraced by the vast majority of Christians from the very beginning. The practice of Christian forgery has a long and distinguished history. The debate lasted 300 years. Even within Orthodox circles there was considerable debate concerning which books to include. This debate primarily concerned whether certain works should be read in the church service or only privately. These works were widely used but not necessarily considered Catholic or universal. Such works include the Didache, Shepherd of Hermas, 1 Clement, 2 Clement, the Epistle of Barnabas, and to a lesser extent the Apocalypse of Peter. Considering the generally accepted dates of authorship for all of the canonical New Testament works, as well as the various witnesses to canonicity extant among the writings of Ignatius, Polycarp, Irenaeus, etc., the 4 Gospels and letters of Paul were universally held as scriptural, and 200 years were needed to finalize the canon, from the beginning of the 2nd century to the mid-4th century. No book in the final canon was ever declared spurious or heretical, except for the Revelation of John, which the Council of Laodicea in 363-364 had rejected. This was possibly due to fears of the influence of Montanism, which used the book extensively to support their theology. See Revelation of John for more details. Athanasius wrote his Easter letter in 367 AD, which defined a canon of 27 books, identical to the current canon, but also listed 2 works that were not in the canon but to be read, the Shepherd of Hermas and the Didache. Nevertheless, the early church leaders in the 3rd and 4th centuries generally distinguished between canonical works and those that were not canonical but useful, or good for teaching, though never relegating any of the final 27 books to the latter category. One aim with establishing the canon was to capture only those works which were held to have been written by the apostles, or their close associates. And as the Muratorian fragment canon states concerning the shepherd of Hermas, but Hermas wrote the shepherd very recently, in our times, in the city of Rome, while Bishop Pius, his brother, was occupying the chair of the Church of the city of Rome, and therefore it ought indeed to be read, but it cannot be read publicly to the people in church either among the prophets, whose number is complete, or among the apostles, for it is after their time.